Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to welcome you to this meeting of the Systems Care Expansion Leadership Learning Community. And our topic today, fitting to our leadership learning community, is leadership. We have had many of you join us before. The learning community is hosted by the TA Network for Children's Behavioral Health that's coordinated through the University of Maryland School of Social Work. We started this learning community last September, October, and it's a monthly community that's designed to support you as system of care leaders in many areas, PIs, PDs, and in content areas as well. And what we've tried to do throughout the year is to address areas that are important to you and to incorporate a more interactive approach that we can use to support your work. I'd like to mention before we go any further that while we've been having monthly meetings, we won't be meeting in July or August, but the learning community meetings will resume in September. And we did send an email to all of the learning community members inviting your suggestions about topics that we should address moving forward, and are very anxious to have your ideas about that. So please let us know if you have content areas that you think would be helpful for us to provide information for you and support for you moving forward. This meeting we would like to use to explore the kinds of roles that you play as leaders in system of care development, and to discuss how you gain both formal and informal leadership roles and how you become authorized and have power over, with, and within. These are areas that our presenter will address as we move forward. And there will be opportunities for questions and answers. As noted in the chat box, your lines are muted. However, we really invite you to put your comments or questions in the chat box, and we'll do our best to recognize those and respond to them as quickly as we can. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Ellen Kagan. Ellen is a specialist in leadership development. She's with Georgetown University Center for Child and Human Development, which is a partner in the Technical Assistance Network. So Ellen, welcome, and thank you for doing this learning community meeting for us. And I will now turn it over to you.
Great. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Beth, thank you for that introduction. As another way of sort of sharing just who I am, and I can see names on the participants list that I recognize. I have been working in the field of system of care since the very beginnings in the 1980s. And if you have participated in one of the leadership academies or one of the leadership institutes from Georgetown's training institutes in the past, would love to see your comments in the chat. Please let me know who you are, and we'll try to make this as interactive as possible. I want to begin this session by sharing with everyone that in my experience, the word leader is very misunderstood in the field. It's used very colloquially in our speech, and this webinar is really an opportunity to kind of tighten it up and begin to see that leadership, like many other things we do, is actually a set of more specific behaviors, more specific attitudes and values and skills that we can begin thinking about. And the first step in that leadership learning journey is really making that distinction in our day-to-day rollout of our work. And once we make that distinction, we can bring in some awareness. And of course, obviously, one of the things I'm going to promote here in this call is that we really need more leadership from each of us in order to actually change the status quo and to create the systems that each of you is involved in. So as you can see in this session, we are going to ask you to consider ways in which leadership is different from the other things that you do, and identify additional opportunities to lead. So let's begin by setting some context, as I said. Leaders who are out in the field, one of the things we know we can count on is change. Systems are changing, communities are changing, the requirements that we're being asked to do are changing, the workforce is changing, and there's always going to be some new thing that's coming onto the table. And that request for change is actually, in my perspective, coming at even a faster pace than it's ever been done before. And that accelerated pace can sometimes force us to kind of double down and kind of really keep that focus on that to-do list. And what I'm going to sort of begin suggesting is that as organizations and agencies are being asked to do something new, that the very basic piece of us as professionals and as family leaders coming into this work is what new things do we need to be thinking about in order to meet the changing requirements of our jobs and of our communities and our agencies, and how do we actually manage that ourselves. So basically, if our environment is changing, so must we. I often think about my colleague Marshall Goldsmith, who is a nationally recognized leadership coach. And one of the things he has said is that for many of us, we get to these positions where we have levels of responsibility. And what Marshall says is that what got us here isn't necessarily what's going to be needed to get us there. So this webinar is really all about thinking about what leadership really is and what we're going to need to do differently in order to mobilize change. In the 1996 book, Deep Change, which was written by a professor at the University of Michigan, he had a research project where he was running around the country looking at different strategic plans. And I'm assuming for a moment that everyone on the call has some familiarity with strategic planning. It's a very basic part of what we do when we start thinking about and recognizing the need for change. And one of the things that he found as he was sort of surveying people's mission statements and vision statements, I want to read to you something that he found that he thought was really, really interesting. He went to an agency that said they wanted to become an, quote, organic organization. And the definition of that was one that is responsive, acts quickly, in a coordinated way, and can adjust and learn and grow. So when I think about those words, responsive, acts quickly, in a coordinated way, can adjust and learn and grow, when I think about those words, I think that is an organization that I would want to be a part of, something that was dynamic, something that was responsive. But what surprised him about this strategic plan in particular was the next sentence. And the next sentence was, only organic individuals can create organic organizations. And so what it really reinforced for him was that if, in fact, we are leaders that want to create these very dynamic, responsive organizations, that if that's what we want out there, then what do we have to do in here to be responsive, learning, growing, changing? And that really set the stage for how I think we're going to be talking about leadership, because in times of change, and I think I'm going to put forward the premise that we are in that moment when our systems are not the way we want them to be, and that we want to lead something that leads to a more dynamic, responsive future. Only organic leaders can do that. And in order to be dynamic, we have to be more flexible, we have to be jugglers of multiple functions, and adapt when situations and circumstances shift. I think these will be the hallmark of the 21st century leader and the leader for system of care, growth, and development. So the second thing we're going to move into in just a moment, as I mentioned in the opening, is understanding at a very deep level that leadership, in order to do this kind of leading change work, is very different from other things that we actually have to do in order to keep our jobs. I think also each of us in that deep sort of personal kind of way have to believe every day when we get up and get into our commuting situation and enter the community that we can believe that we can lead change and that we have the vision to be able to do that, the vision for ourselves. And lastly, we're committed, and I want to say to a lifelong endeavor of developing leadership skills, habits, and behaviors. For those of us that maybe have been in the system of care world since the 1980s, and we may have something to share, the thing about that is we are constantly having to retool and double down and make sure that each of us, regardless as to how long we've been in the field and what our functions have been, have to keep moving forward. So we're going to start with this idea that leadership is not a thing. It's not a noun. It's actually a verb. It's more like a process. And because it's not a noun, it is really more about actions that we take rather than positions we hold. And so those of you on the phone that are maybe middle management, maybe in the clinical world, at the front line, the front desk, you may have various different kinds of titles and positions. This conversation is not about your position, but really about the actions and behaviors you will take over the course of your work life and community life to create change. So leadership is really about what we do, and it's not about the role we are in. And typically when we think of leadership, where do we look for people to lead us? And I want to put forward that for the most part, we actually look for leadership by looking up, by looking to the people who are in the top positions. I'm often really struck when I'm out in the field how often we use the word leader and or leadership to actually mean the person who's holding the position at the very top of an organization. And in my career, I have done work at the community level, at the state level, at the federal level. And very often when I'm out in the field and I'm facilitating a conversation at a community level or at an agency level, you know, everybody's talking about how we're going to create change and what we can do. And just inevitably, someone around the table says, if only the state. If only the state wouldn't send the money down so siloed, if only there wouldn't be so many data requirements, if only there would be more flexibility, if only the state. As if by looking up to the state, that would solve the problem. And so you can imagine I'm sitting at a state table in a particular state with all the different agencies sitting around and people wanting very much to design new ways of thinking about how we deliver services to children and their families. And inevitably someone around that table, whether it's child welfare, mental health, juvenile justice, education, public health, will say, if only the feds, if only the federal government didn't have so many grants, so many different grants, you know, 3-year grants, 5-year grants, 1-year grants. I feel like all I'm doing is writing grants. And every grant has a different definition of the population. Every grant has a different funding cycle. If only the feds. Looking up. We're looking up. And then sometimes I'm working at the federal level. And I'm working with very earnest federal officials, mostly from different agencies and different perspectives. And we'll be talking about, you know, is it possible to link our funding streams? Is it possible to do this? And they always feel very, very constrained, and it feels like everything is really like immobile and not able to be as adaptable as they want it to be. And inevitably, somebody around the table will go, it's not us, and they'll look up and they'll say something like, it's God. It's only God. And of course that didn't really happen, but as I'm thinking about looking up, I often think that we align the idea of change and looking up as so simultaneously and so intertwined that to break that way of thinking is something I want to offer to each of you listening. And for those of you who know me and have been to some of the Georgetown leadership programs, understand that really the whole message here is that we can lead from any chair, that we do not have to necessarily be in a position with a title. We don't have to wait for any of that to happen. I also like to sort of remind us that this way of thinking is so normal and natural because even our very school systems, those of us that grew up in the Western and United States school system, it's about the teacher being in the front of the class and the teacher asking students questions. And really the most important thing was sort of the teacher holding on to that way of, that control of the room, and we as students were waiting for the teacher to guide us. I think current educators are now beginning to sort of rethink those kinds of systems to actually build leadership into the classroom setting as well. I often like to think about it is that for most of us growing up, we probably got to the positions that we're in is because we were very good problem solvers. We were very good at answering questions. And then we hit something as complex, as intricate, as multifaceted as developing and designing collaborative systems of care. And we find that we as individuals don't necessarily have the answers, and we can kind of begin to feel as though what happened. Because our idea that leaders had answers, and that is another sort of model that we will want to rethink as we move forward in this leadership conversation. So putting forward leadership in a more targeted perspective, this idea that leadership is a process. And it's a process of envisioning and initiating change. And the idea is that we envision this and we begin to put it out there, but the hallmark of leadership is our ability to mobilize others, to really alter the status quo in response to an urgent challenge or a compelling opportunity. Leadership is also a set of behaviors. It's a behavior that embraces relationships. So I do want to say here and now that you have to like people. I often say you have to love people. You have to kind of love the people that are in the office next to you and in the office down the hall from you. Because leadership is a relationship-based activity. It is something that really is enhanced as we do it together. The second thing is that it's a behavior that has change as its essential goal. So if the goal is kind of maintaining the status quo and keeping things moving and keeping things running, we may not need so much of this leadership thing that we're going to continue talking about. But certainly, if things are stuck or stagnant, or if there's so much resistance, this is really when the behaviors of leadership always will come into play. And lastly, leadership requires each of us to have this very, very deep awareness about our mind, our body, our voice, our spirit, our heart. Very, very often people will walk into meetings just completely uncentered and kind of just wait until things roll out. I want to suggest that as leaders, we need to actually begin to think about our awareness. And once we build our awareness and we move into that collaborative space with others, and maybe we'll use the collaborative table as the metaphor for this conversation, it's an awareness to actually strengthen the relationships that you have with others. It could also be that in that moment of awareness, our role as leaders is to bring clarity to a really complex and confusing conversation. Another leadership awareness can be asking a good question and kind of facilitating people's knowledge and understanding about what's happening in the room. On the flip side, if our awareness isn't centered, we might actually inadvertently, because we are not being as aware as we need to be, we might shut someone down. That is not leadership behavior. We might show frustration, use our voice, roll our eyes, send off the vibe that, we might be dismissing something. We might also be blaming other people, blaming other systems, other actions, prior actions. That's also not leadership behavior. And lastly, if we're not aware, we might blow off the whole meeting and not show up. And one of the hallmarks of leadership is this awareness and the behavior that leaders continue to show up. So if leadership is a process, if it is a set of behaviors, if it is a set of awarenesses, then I guess what I really want to put forward is that each of us is going to need to be on this leadership experience as a personal journey. What I have to learn as a leader is going to be different from what you have to learn as a leader. If you have an opportunity to think about this more deeply, you may find you have a short fuse, and that may be something you have to work on. It may be that you are tired, and that's something you have to work on. So leadership is a personal journey, and I guess the second thing about this is that it really does cover just about every aspect of our lives. I often think that, thank God a day is over. I can leave my office. I don't have to be so aware of my actions, and I can kind of just let it all hang out. And yet what I find is that my leadership work is enhanced when I maintain that awareness and really bring it into my home life, my civic life, my volunteer life, my relationships with my friends, with my family, because it really is a practice to build. And in that sense, it is kind of a 24/7 opportunity for all of us to step into. Because it's a personal journey, I want to also say that leadership is a choice, and we're going to continue to sort of put that out there because you sometimes don't have choices about other parts of our work life. We are required to do the things we're required to do based on our job descriptions, based on the person who, the organization that hired us. And making the choice not to do those things could actually cause us to lose our job. So I want to put that out there that there are some opportunities where we really have to be on our game. And leadership is a 24/7 thing, and it is a choice that we can or cannot do. We may take on, we may not take on. Of course, it's distinct from other things we do. So leadership is not management, as you can see. It is not having authority, which we'll discuss in a few moments. It is not advocacy, which is another function in systems change. It's not being a strategic planner, nor is it being a facilitator, even though you will use facilitation skills. Those are roles that are not synonymous with being a leader. So let's start with talking about management, which is probably what takes up, a big, big chunk of our focus. I want to share with you that management is a field that's been around as a research-based field since probably the late 1800s. Which in a sense puts it out there as a relatively newer discipline. It's certainly older than things like physics or geometry or algebra. And in management, it emerged as a really important part of the work life during the Industrial Revolution. It emerged at a time when people went to work. So before that, people were actually working in small farms, they were working in guilds, but when the environment changed and people went en masse to a particular place, the field of management really began to be required and began to thrive. And the field of management is an amazing field. It is the field that brought us org charts, as you can see. It brought us budgets. It brought us planning, goals, objectives. It brought us evaluation as a tool to help us monitor ourselves against our plan. Management actually helps us around the areas of creating policies and procedures and kind of helping us develop very strong systems, and then asks us to repeat those systems day in and day out, thus creating what I'm going to call in a very good way at this point is something that is really status quo. It is probably a very good thing that there's a lot of good, strong management, that each of you has a desk, that you know where to go for computer support, that you know how to requisition supplies. All of that comes out of the management field, and thank goodness for management. But management is not leadership. So what is leadership really about, and when did it emerge as a research-based discipline? And some of you may be surprised that leadership really is the newest comer in a research-based perspective, and probably some of the earliest research came in the 1980s, the late 1980s, and really you could not get a PhD in leadership until the 2000s, and even today, I mean, even though it's an exploding field and many more people are doing research in this area, it is still not an everyday part of curricula in universities across the country. Before there was a research base of leadership, I think we learned how to talk about leadership either through the military, sometimes through business, perhaps, but really I think some of the earliest leadership conversations came through our religious institutions, through ancient religious text study, cultural mythology, and the like. And you can see here on the slide the topics of leadership, the things that really are kind of the cornerstone to leadership, are things that weren't necessarily the cornerstone of management. So if we make it a simple sort of dichotomy here, just to clarify what we've been talking about, is that in our management role, our job is to maintain the status quo. It's to make sure that things run smoothly. It makes sure that there is a timeline and kind of a routine around what we do. Staff meetings every Monday morning, collaborative meetings, once a month, setting an agenda, setting out time notices. And all of that is a very, very, very important function in order to maintain the status quo. On the other side, however, it's leaders that create the opportunity to change the status quo. And here's what's really crazy about this conversation of leadership, because I don't know anyone who really has only the role to lead. If we are working in systems change, the chances, and connected to an agency or an organization or a community system or a state system, chances are really good. We've got good, strong management responsibility as well. And so here we are as a leader kind of doing both of these functions at the very same time. We're maintaining the status quo, and that's one part of us, and we are so passionate about changing the status quo as the other. So what I'd like to ask you to do in the chat box, if you would just put out some words that kind of begin to reflect when management is doing its job well, what are some of the feelings and some of the good, strong emotions that might occur in our workspace? So let me throw that out as a question, and all of you can sort of see the chat box there. What are some of the feelings, and what's good about management? Great. So we've got some appreciation for the status quo, So that's good. We feel good about that. Good. What else? It's predictable. Absolutely. Chair Clark or Clark Chair, that's awesome. And Carla, management can help with morale because then it won't be so chaotic. And yes, we've got structure and roles are clarified. Great. Good. You know, I think all of these that you said, and I really appreciate that the words appreciation and morale are there, because if we walked into a space where there were no rules, we didn't know what was happening, it would be chaos. It really, really would be chaos. And I kind of want to share with you in a moment what some of your predecessors also said. Let's see if I can do that. Here we go. All right. So here we have also the sort of the infinity loop, as you can see. And on the management side, we've got predictability, structure, and roles are clarified as has been put out into the chat. So we've got safety, it's safe, it's stable. And on the leadership side, in a way, if we're changing the status quo, we are actually creating instability. We're creating an unstable environment. And that means it's kind of hard for people. It may not be so easy. It's not a routine. It's not predictable. In the chat box, take a moment and think about what are some of the things that could be created in an environment when a change agent comes in and starts to change things. What are we feeling? What's happening? A lot of fear. Like, what's going to happen to my job? How am I going to cope with this? Lots and lots of uncertainty and confusion. Beautiful, beautiful. Let's get some more. Right, people will start making assumptions, the perception that there's going to be more work because I know the routine work. It's stable, it's predictable, and it's this perception of more work. Well, absolutely. So here's what some of your predecessors also shared. Good. Dennis, let's see what you're going to say. Here we go again. Yeah, it's just uncomfortable. We are actually, we want change. We do. We know it's going to create a better environment, but the idea of it is actually more palatable than the actual doing it. So if management creates order, then leadership creates chaos. And the last thing I want to share with you here is that from leaders I've talked to throughout the years, this is the thing that's the hardest. It's like, I try to put a new idea out there. I want us to work in different ways. But what I end up feeling is resistance. So I like to think of resistance, and I'll put this out there for your consideration, is that resistance is kind of the loving partner of leadership. We know that leadership is present. We know it's present when we are feeling that resistance. And in a very odd way, I want to say that is a good thing. We actually know that the leadership function is alive and well. And this is kind of you. I thought that was sort of an interesting way to think about it. We are constantly juggling between the leadership role and the management role. So we're now going to pose a question for all of you to think about. In your role, where do you spend the most time? Because even though we may want to be the change agent, and even though we are dreaming and visioning about the future, the big question is, are we actually able to get out of our management selves, which is required of us, and actually move into bringing in more leadership opportunities? So what you have in front of you is a piece of work from Richard Daft and Robert Lengel, and they noticed that vision of one of many things that is required of leadership. But leadership in stability versus leadership in change, or leadership in the management role versus leadership in a leading change role actually looks really different. And here you have on the left-hand side of this column the idea that leading in a management role is about managing to the future, using data, pursuing goals and objectives, directing people, delegating to people, focusing on money and budgets and measurements. Sometimes we might even feel that dreams are kind of fuzzy and unrealistic, and we kind of stick with what's doable or what's logical. We might scorn vision, but we know we need a statement, right? Every good organization needs that statement that we can put on our walls or in our strategic plans. And in the role of manager, we are actually living by tomorrow's deadlines, that to-do list, that check the box for everything we have to accomplish in a day. On the right-hand side is the leader in a leadership role. And in a moment, I'm going to bring up a poll that I want to just set you up for. A leader in the leadership role does not think about necessarily directing or goals or the doable or the logical or the hard data kind of component. A leader in a leadership role is really believing that these very higher purpose values that we have should be what we should be focusing on, our yearnings. We think big, we do the impossible, we cherish vision as motivating and energizing, and we live by hope and personal experience and kind of that gut instinct. Every single day on the right-hand side are things that we can do. So here is my request. My request is, imagine you look at your calendar and you think back to the last 2 weeks that you have spent in the office doing work. All right, so if you've got your calendar close at hand, or if your memory is good, I want you to think back 2 weeks. And I want to give you 4 stars or 4 checks. And I want you to look at this list of 16 different behaviors and activities. And I want you to identify the 4 things where you have spent the most time. Not what you wish you did, not what you had hoped to do, but really sort of that hard self-awareness about where am I spending my time. Okay, so I'm looking at the chat box to see if there's any question about the instruction. So you have 4 little checks. And imagine this was a hard copy exercise. Where are you spending your time? And you can see the poll. Great. See 11 of you. There are 28, I think, on the call. Let's see if we can get a few more. Good. You get 4 check boxes. Where do your selections fall more into the management role on the left, leadership role on the right, or equally between management and leadership, and where you have spent your time in the last 2 weeks. Good. Let's see if we can get just a few more. Anything? Great. All right, so let's see what we have as we reflect. And your, I'm not sure if my system is working. I can only make one selection. I'm wondering if one of my team wants to respond to that. I think you were only asked to make one selection, Dennis, so whether it was that more of your checks in your, these are more metaphorical checks, would be more in the management role, more in the leadership role, or are they equally divided between the two? Oh, okay, great, thank you. So, you know, it's interesting. An exercise like this is really to build in that self-awareness that I mentioned earlier about leadership is all about being very mindful of how we are behaving in an interaction and where are we really sitting. And it's actually no surprise that many of us find ourselves mostly in the management role. I have done a survey, brief survey on job descriptions that are out there, and even roles that talk about being agents of change are really focusing on management activities. And for those of you in a leadership role, I'd be really curious if you want to throw in your ideas onto the chat, because those of us that are in a leadership role often come from the world of advocacy, often have less sort of lines of accountability to systems, are more free agents in their ability to do their work, and other times not. And then some of us are equally divided between management and leadership. So I'm just wondering, in the reflections, does anyone want to share a little aha for themselves as they have thought about this? Anybody want to sort of throw out an aha for themselves, sort of as you think about this? And Ruth, I can see you're typing. Jennifer, great. You know, if we were face-to-face, I'd be drawing these ahas and awarenesses, and we would be sharing them verbally. On a webinar, we'll need to do that through the chat function. So great. Yeah. Right. Yeah, great. Good. Good. So as you're responding, I just want to sort of see if I can sort of reflect on some of the comments. I often think really even about my own purpose as a person in this work, and we come to this work very often with that fire in our bellies and that purpose on the right-hand side to really provide that leadership. And very often, without us even thinking about it, it kind of narrows our focus into the management role. What I want to share with you, and this will take perhaps another webinar, is that this conversation is not to advocate or to promote the idea that we leave our management selves behind. The idea here is to not forget that we have a leadership function even as we are doing our management work. And I put that out there as something, you know, just sort of a comment to kind of settle in and a way to raise the awareness a little bit about how even in our interactions, because we all work in these bureaucracies, as Mira has said, and to not necessarily be frustrated by it, but to see how we can bring in more of these leadership functions to help elevate the work that we are doing and bring change forward. This handout, by the way, is in the file, and there are 3 documents in the file, and before we leave this topic, I wanted to share with you that there's a wonderful, wonderful outline of leading is, managing is, as well as a hard copy of this slide. Sometimes it's helpful to just kind of tack it up on your wall to kind of keep yourself anchored in where you want to be, sort of in both spaces. So I hope by now, since we've kind of disaggregated leadership from management, I also want to disaggregate leadership from authority. Because this is really one of the gifts that Ron Heifetz, who was the founder of the adaptive leadership field, kind of gave to us. And the idea here is that we have authority. By virtue of us having a job, by virtue of us having a job description, by virtue of us being in a bureaucracy, being in an organization with a hierarchy, we have authority. We actually have probably more authority than we think. We just have to be clear about what we have authority over in terms of our formal authority. So if, for those of you who are working in systems of care, in organizations and agencies, I'll get the ball rolling, and let's open up the chat again, sort of to think about what do you have formal authority to do, right? So you might have, I'll throw one out, you might have formal authority to supervise your direct report. Okay, that might be one type of authority that you have. What are some other types of formal authority that you have in your work? Great. Okay, Dennis, I'm going to get back to your comment in a second. Yes, we have actually probably managed budgets, move funds, manage those budgets. Right. The interesting thing about moving system of care forward, Dennis, I want you to be a little more specific in what you mean by that, because one of the things that we don't have authority to do is actually to change people's values, attitudes, and behaviors. So which part of moving the system of care forward do you have authority over? Yes, we have authority to establish policy, to establish protocols, to sign our names to memorandums of understanding, to execute contracts, to provide technical assistance to our site. Beautiful. All of these things, yeah. I'm waiting for Dennis to get back to me. So authority to engage and set collaborative tables. Right. So the inviting we have authority to do, right? To actually create those things, to oversee contracted providers, policy, quality control, all of this is what we have formal authority to do. We have authority, thanks Dennis, to educate folks on what the system of care is all about. We have the authority to educate even in the values. So that's great. So those are all the things that we have formal authority to do by virtue of our position, and we have the authority, as Tara is suggesting to us, to actually recommend new processes and new policies and new procedures to support those practices. So all of that is within our domain, And so now I want to move to the idea of informal authority. There are tables that we sit around where the people around the table are not our direct reports. We actually have no formal line of authority over them. We don't evaluate them. We don't hire them. We don't necessarily have authority to fire them. And so we have this situation where we're often at tables where we actually don't have formal authority and we actually have to use informal leadership in order to move processes forward. And we're going to talk more now about this idea of having informal authority in order to move processes forward. So there are, as we just talked about, there's two ways to gain authority. One, of course, is by your position, which we just talked about, and you gave examples from a positional perspective of where we have authority. And the other way in which we gain authority, even if we don't have formal authority, is through our leadership behavior, is through our capacity to strengthen relationships, bring clarity, ask good questions, mobilize forces to change. And this idea about by position is one thing. So you've already got that, and you probably have a lot of good support within your organization to do your job well. It's this informal authority that I want to put a spotlight on so that we can begin talking about how we actually can gain more of this, because in system of care work, because it is so collaborative, and because we can't really direct, delegate people to change, we have to actually use the skills of informal authority way more than we have to use the skills of formal authority, and begin to elevate that capacity in a greater way. So I want to just conceptually just kind of lay this out for us just so that we're clear. Formal authority, if we haven't already laid this out, is authorized by the powers of an office, by the powers of a position, and it is typically granted through a recognized source. So when you signed your employment agreement, or for those of you who are elected officials and someone has voted you into office, these types of formal authority and the authorization process happens at discrete times. I also want to say that if you get a promotion, right, in your work and you get a new job description, it's a quantum leap and it's a very specific time. I also want to mention just in terms of formal authorization, this is also true for people who have medical degrees, law degrees, licensing, certification. All of those formal authorizations allow you to do certain things that other people do not have authority to do. I am not a psychiatrist, so if I went into your community, no matter, how I wanted to, I do not have authority to do the work of psychiatry or a psychologist or a lawyer, etc. So those are formal, the way in which we grant formal authority. Creating informal authorization is a much different type of experience. And I want to put it out there so, again, our awareness can be elevated, and so we can begin thinking about how in our day-to-day work we can actually gain authority cross-agency, cross-department, cross-system, cross-boundaries, cross-hierarchies in order to gain more influence and therefore be able to do what Dennis was really talking about earlier, is really moving the system of care forward. Right? The reason it may be stalled out is that we're not seeing enough informal authority that has been granted to us by our leadership behavior. So when we think about gaining authority by behavior, we look at an informal authorization process. It is earned. It is not granted by a job description, and it is typically granted by the people, whether it's the people in your office, the people in your collaborative table, the people in your systems. This is the kind of thing where people are coming to you because they believe that you have something that they need, that they want, that they trust. Informal leadership is authorized based on your experiences and how much you put yourself out there to support other people. It can also be granted through your knowledge, your more tangible knowledge about how to do something or how something is supposed to run. And as I keep mentioning, it's also about your behavior. Informal leadership is granted regardless of position, and it can change without changing your environment. So you can be in a static position and you can gain informal authority through your behavior. So I want to open up the chat again just to kind of begin to get deeper into this. Because if I'm sort of throwing out to all of you that in order to create change, in order to create systems change, and we're going to feel that resistance, we're going to feel that instability, we're going to feel that people aren't moving, and suggesting that we should use our informal leadership capacity at a deeper level, how do you gain informal authority? And very specifically, I gave some broad categories like your behaviors, that it's earned. But you just share with me your experiences, what you've seen, either things that you've done or things that other people do to gain informal authority. Great. Right. Relationships are absolutely at the core of leadership. Beautiful. See, there's lots of really a lot of synergy, integrity by doing what you say that you're going to do, by having knowledge, really being sensitive, being vulnerable, being open, especially when unexpected consequences occur. Beautiful, because it's not going to be a smooth road. Management and all of our planning kind of like lets us think it's going to be a smooth road, but we know from our leadership work that we're going to fail, we're going to have bumps in the road, we're going to fall into the sidewalk, that hole in the sidewalk. We can share our resources. We can honor others' points of view, even if they are different from our own, right? Which is one of the absolute foundations of building those sound relationships. Honoring those other points of view, cultivating a network of contacts. So Greg, I often think about leadership work in systems of care. One of my mantras in the Leadership Academy is build those relationships before you need them, right? Because that's how we're going to build that influence and build that trust. And then when the time comes when we need to use each other's resources, those are there. Beautiful. Great, great. Michelle, really nice to see your name pop up. It's really being open to the perspectives of others. I often think, when I think about the distinction here between leading by position versus leading by behavior. When we lead by position, we have this kind of mental model or this assumption that because I'm in authority, people are going to do what I say. And sometimes they do, because we are in that position of authority. Very, very often I've seen people in authority rely way too heavily on their authority and not on building these other leadership perspectives and behaviors, and therefore we fall flat on our face. We say, I've done everything by the book. You gave me this job. Why is this not happening? And I offer to you, as you think about your jobs and your day-to-day responsibilities, not to rely so much on your authority, but to really be thinking about how even with your authority, it really takes informal authority and kind of that leadership behavior to actually influence people enough to have them consider making a change. And so all the things that you have said are really things that we need to bring on more in order, even with our authority, and even in our jobs, and even as we do the management. Leaders who actually gain informal authority are people who are out there. I loved Tara, that you put out there, that we have to be vulnerable. And in order to do that, we've got to build our network of support around us so that when we step out, we're not stepping out alone, and that we're doing it together. You know, the other piece that leaders can use to gain informal authority is to really gain some clarity about our purpose and our passion. And oftentimes, people that we're asking to change, right? So we're asking people to get out of their comfort zone and to try something different. And one of the ways in which we can help those folks is by hearing them, hearing what their concerns are, and also helping to bring clarity to why we're asking them to do it. And in that way, we have to hear their perspectives, as you've stated in the chat. We also have to be clear about our own. And really be clear. Am I here to collect a paycheck? Am I here because there wasn't another job open in my town or in my field in my town? I often, in leadership academies, especially early in the day when system of care directors were actually required to come, one of the things that we actually coached around was this whole idea was, am I really in the right job? Because I don't really like change, and I would rather manage something. You know, you have to be clear that your purpose specifically is to actually create change, and that is something that you are passionate about. And lastly, I think the piece here about gaining informal authority has a lot to do with confidence. You know, I was 26 years old. I think about this, and Beth, you'll laugh, because Beth was there when this happened. I was 26 years old when I got this phone call from Ira Lurie, who at the time was the Gary Blau in system of care world. And he was the federal government, and I was working for the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors. And my boss didn't really like the federal government. In fact, it was one of those situations where if you looked up, he was actually kind of cranky about the federal government. And one of the things that happened when Ira Lurie called me is he asked me if I would have a meeting to talk about how the state and how the federal government, could actually partner to create something new and different in the area of children's mental health. Well, at the time, I was the director of the children's program at the State Mental Health Program Directors Association, and I had a dilemma. My boss probably, if I had gone to ask him, he probably would have said no. Or he might have reprimanded me for even having the conversation in the first place. But as Beth knows, because Beth was doing amazing work at the time with the federal government as a really valued consultant and very trusted advisor, that meeting took place. And I sat down with Ira Lurie and Judith Katz-Levy and had that conversation. And I often look back on that and I think, you know, it was a risk. It also was sort of confidence that I actually didn't have, if truth be told, but I knew that a conversation could not be bad because I was very clear about my purpose and my passion. And what came of that after several other conversations was a very small contract to the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors to actually run a national meeting that created the system of care. I actually had the confidence to facilitate that meeting when I had no idea what I was doing. So I'm going to suggest to all of us that we go out there and take those risks and be confident in our experiences, even if they're not directly aligned with the work that we're doing now. Really be confident about the backgrounds that you have and what you bring to this work. And even if you're not an expert in creating change, even if you're not an expert even in children's mental health, you know, or you're asked to step into other systems and you're not an expert in juvenile justice or child welfare, be confident about your background and what you know be prepared, be open, and when I say prepared, I don't mean it from an expertise perspective. I mean, be prepared to ask questions. Be prepared to show your vulnerability. Be prepared to help to connect the ideas to other ideas that are out there. Educate yourself or educate others about what you care about and the things that are important to you, and make the linkages with people about what you have to offer and then what they have to offer. And lastly, I will tell you that while all of this is important, the fire in your belly, the ability to believe that you can create change and that conviction to do so will inspire others and will help build that informal authority. So as we begin to wind down in our conversation on this distinctions, I want to put out a word about power, because power is real and it is perceived. I often, in the world of leadership coaching, and as I'm now working with many leaders from systems of care and in other related fields, what I'm finding is that fear of power, or fear of the power of others over us, is actually stymieing our work. And I want to put it out there that I've yet to meet a leader that actually steps out of the box. You may get your hand slapped, but I've yet to meet one that didn't actually be grateful and thankful that they actually did. So each of us has actually way more power, personal power, us power, than we might be giving us credit for, giving ourselves credit for. And so I'd like you to consider just for a moment these 4 different ways to think about power, and therefore how much power we actually do have within us and the awareness of that power. So we talked a few moments ago about your authority, and that really is power over. We all have power over something, and it's a way to think about it when you link it with the idea of authority. But that's not the only power that we have. We have the power within ourselves to be able to draw upon our experiences, our backgrounds, our passions, and our purposes. And that lives and breathes every day when we make that recommitment to our leadership role. We also have power to do things, power to create opportunities. And when I say create opportunities, I want to go back to what you've already said in the chat so beautifully, is that I have the opportunity to create relationships every day. I have the opportunity to sit down and have lunch with somebody that I've never had lunch with. You know, I'm sure you know the research that they have done with the echograms on our environment, and most of us are spending the same 90% of our time with the same 6 people in our universe. And how do we have to push ourselves out of our comfort zone to say, you know, in a month, how many new people, and do I have the power to build new relationships with? And that leads us to the last one, is that we have power together. It's the power with others comes something even much deeper than we have alone. So 4 different ways to think about power, and I want to put that out there for you. And here's 2 quotes that I hope will inspire you or offer something for you to think about. The one on the left is from my 2 unbelievable colleagues at the National Center for Cultural and Linguistic Competence, Tawara Good and Vivian Jackson. A leader uses and shares power to create a vision and achieve a desired outcome or goal. So the idea here is that we actually probably don't do much alone at all, and we're really sharing our power with others. And the second is from Robin Sharma, and she has said to us, basically, to lead without a title is to derive your power within the organization, not from your position, but from your competence, effectiveness, relationships, excellence, innovation, and ethics. I'm going to pause for a second and see if there are any questions or comments in the chat box that people are sort of beginning to think about with regard to formal, informal authority, leading with authority, and leading without authority. Anybody want to sort of throw an aha out there for all of us to learn from? So I think my example was that I think as a very young person, I understood the distinction between formal authority and informal authority, but it wasn't until I was much older and actually diving into the leadership literature that I actually realized that what I had done in meeting with the federal government to help launch the System of Care grant program was really acting as an informal leader. So I'll put that out there and for all of your reflections, and maybe we'll come back to it at the end with some questions. The last couple of points I want to make, we're not going to do quite as deep a dive as we did with authority and management, is this idea that leadership is different from advocacy. And let me just put this whole thing up here and we can begin to see. So just like we need management in the work of systems change and in building systems of care, we also need the work of advocates and advocacy, and it is different from leadership. So let's just make sure we have that distinction. So in advocacy, what advocates are renowned to do is using the skills of telling, arguing, persuading, really also using passion. They also keep people focused on the task at hand, like making sure that we keep putting the issues back on the table. And that is quite the role of advocacy, and we need advocacy in our work. As distinguished from leadership and what leaders do, we're offering to you that leaders actually don't do a lot of telling, arguing, or persuading, even as we feel our passion. But we use that passion differently, and we use that passion to go more to inquiry. It is more important, as was said in the chat box, for us to understand the perspectives of others, and therefore we have to use the skills of asking and reflecting. We also have to use our skills in bringing people together, not to argue and tell and persuade. We need to bring people together to actually mobilize the resources that are out there in order to create that change. And lastly, like advocacy, leaders also keep people focused on the work ahead of us. And like advocates, we want to make sure that if you put something on a table and everyone ignores you, that you make sure that you keep putting that issue back on the table. So that's the distinction between advocacy and leadership. And then lastly, just want to put out there as something for us to think about, and that is leadership is different from facilitating a meeting. We will use facilitation skills for sure, but facilitators as a profession actually stand outside the work, and they stand outside the culture of the organization, and their job is only to manage the process, whereas leaders are internal and integral part of the work and the culture, and we've got a lot of emotions going on because of our history and our relationships with others around the table. Facilitators walk in and they're really fairly neutral. Facilitators don't have a stake in the game. I think leaders actually do. And what I'm seeing more and more of, which I'm so happy about, is that system of care leaders are bringing in facilitators to be allies in the work. Because very often, those of us that have roles and responsibilities to move the work forward are also asked to be in that facilitator position. And that is really a very difficult task to be in, especially when you want your voice to be part of the conversation and kind of really asking and reflecting as well. So please consider, as you're considering leading from whatever chair you're in, bringing in your colleagues whose work is around facilitation. So as we conclude here, I want to reinforce this idea that we as individuals have many different functions to play in the role of systems of care. We have management roles, we have advocacy roles, we can sometimes act as facilitators. But that for those of us that really seek change, to put this idea out there that as we sit, we can lead from any chair, no matter where we're sitting, and that we can actually find a way to use our voice in a way that brings people together, that elevates the topic, that keeps putting the ideas back out on the table, and that you will choose, even if we're frustrated, even if we're tired, and even if we're cranky, that you, all of you, will continue to lead this movement because the very lives of our communities are at stake. I leave you with a series of reflection questions that I hope will be useful to you as you move forward in your work. I hope this webinar has elevated the ideas around the different functions that you play, and I hope each of you will choose leadership. So now I'd like to offer an opening. Beth has put out there to add a comment or question or request additional TA on leadership that you would like to see offered in the future. Anybody out there been to a training that I've been a part of in leadership? We have a whole new generation, maybe. Oh, great. Great. I recognize you, Michelle. Great. I would love to hear from you. Lisa, I can see that you're typing. I've been wondering where you were. Great. Great. I wonder how the network captures sort of that information, Lisa. It was so great to know that you're there as a team, because leading alone can be really lonely, and when we all sort of reorient ourselves that as we're managing and doing our jobs, we really have to not lose sight of our leadership role and function. So, Lisa, glad you were there as a team, and Pratima, it sounds like Susan was there too, so that's great.
Yeah. So this is Beth. We do encourage you to include teams in any of the learning community meetings where you feel that team members in your states and communities would benefit from participating. And I would like to reiterate that there are documents at the bottom of your screen that you can download, the handouts and worksheets that Ellen mentioned, and also the PowerPoint that you asked for. And I'd like to add my thanks to you, Ellen, for today, but also for your many years of work and dedication to developing leadership in systems of care and in the system of care world. And to Colin for handling Colin Diesenberg from the TA Network for handling all the technical aspects of this, and Denise Solzbach, who co-directs the learning community with me. Remember to send us your ideas for priority topics moving forward. I would like to remind you also to look at the TA Telegram that we send out weekly for other TA activities that are available to support your work, and there's a large menu of those that you can take advantage of. And finally, to wish you a good summer and invite you to join us in September when we resume the learning community. Denise, would you like to add something?
I think you covered it, Beth. Thank you. Happy summer to everyone. And thank you, Ellen, for doing this for us today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, everyone, for your wonderful participation, and I hope to see you at another leadership learning activity. Have a great summer.
Thank you, everybody.